So we will actually be dealing with this topic that we tackled when finishing the Q&A with Antonio Gandano, which is training our future architects in architecture and urban planning and traditional construction. So we have Stefanos Polyzoides as moderator. He comes from Moulin and Polyzoides. He is a reference internationally for urban planning, traditional urban planning and contemporary urban planning. And Francis and Catherine Running, Dean of the Architecture School of the University of Notre Dame. Thank you so much, Stefanos.
I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the panelists for taking part today in this discussion. They're distinguished academics and professionals. They're going to have to excuse me for just saying very few words about who they are, so we save time for presentations, asking questions and answers, and receiving questions for the public. Francisco Uviña Contreras is the director of the Preservation and Regionalism Program at the University of New Mexico in the United States. Sanjeev Singh is a professor in the Department of Architecture and Planning in Bhopal, India, and currently the dean of a school. Fernando Vela Cossío is a geographer and archaeologist who's professor in the Escola Superior de Arquitectura in the Politécnica of Madrid. And Michael Lykoudis, who was the dean for the golden age of the School of Architecture at Notre Dame between about 2000 and 2020, and now a professor and always a professor in the school. And he's a practicing architect in South Bend, Indiana. So let's begin with the first question. I'm going to be asking a question and expecting brief answers from all of you. Questions that have to do with the teaching of architecture in the present. The first question is based on the challenge of the architectural profession acting in ways where the buildings being designed are understood as being separate from the long range of precedents that have existed in our profession and in society over the longest period of time. They're autonomously placed in cities, independent of everything around them. How does your school teach architecture with reference to precedents, to the ideas that have preceded us? Francisco.
Oh, thank you, Stefanos, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, Alejandro, as well. One of the issues I think that when it comes to at least our program at the University of New Mexico School of Architecture and Planning is, you've been there before as well, Stefanos, and know New Mexico quite well. When it comes to the precedents, I don't feel they are taught, at least the precedents, historical precedents in the regional sense. I mean, we do have historic courses that are taught, during the semester. However, one of the courses that Chris Wilson, your colleague, taught in the past, which is the Southwest Architecture, the history of Southwest architecture and cultural landscapes. There was a moment there where there was a break because Chris Wilson left, somewhat left, he's still there, presence, but he did step down from the directorship of the Historic Preservation Program. So then I took it over. So we have recently, about a year ago, taken over that course, the historic Southwest of the architecture, history of the Southwest architecture. We've taken it over, and hopefully that will start to bring in some of that light of some of the local precedents that are very much needed at the university.
Thank you, Francisco. Sanjeev?
Thank you, Stephanie. At our school, when I've been conducting vernacular studio for past 10 years, and I see traditional and vernacular to different ways. And what we are doing, because we need a precedence, because our students who are more from urban areas, they have not even seen the tribal shelters, which are very diverse in nature, with a different, very different social order in the settlements and a very different spatial logic. So the precedence is very much necessary. And what we do is that there are certain very good examples. And itself in Bhopal, where our school is located, there is a Museum of Man, which has life-size exhibits of around 40 to 45 tribal houses, which they brought it from the original place, dismantled it, and then brought it to the museum, and then they reconstructed it at a given site. So we start with the documentation of that. So the precedence is very much necessary, but basically with that initiates the understanding within a student towards vernacular architecture, which is very diverse in India. In India, you will find the climatic regions and the culture, and the culture is very diverse. We have so many cultures here and rituals. So in order to understand that, the first-hand information through documentation and understanding the precedents is very much required, and we do it through documentation and resource person, which are basically tribal craftsmen, how they build it and what is the technique of building it. So we do it in that way, so that an initial understanding of the precedents is among the students, and then from there we take on the studio, which goes to the another level.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Fernando?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefanos. Well, as professor of history of architecture and urban planning, it would be paradoxical for me to say that we do not take into account the history and the precedents. Obviously, we do take them into account. Now, it is also true that what I don't really know is how interesting that is for the students. I don't know how very interested they are in those subject matters. So what architecture students are interested in? And very often they are very far from being interested in the past in general terms. I believe that our mission, our challenge really, is to be capable to show them the power of the past and the importance of the past in their understanding and interpretation of the present, and quite possibly with regards to planning for the future. So in that sense, I believe that in these last few years, teaching history and in some aspects, those elements that have to do with our heritage, we have seen some opportunities, or we have opened some fields of opportunity in this task of raising awareness. For instance, understanding the 20th century heritage. I think that right now this is being found interesting amongst our students. So I think that studying the past and studying the contexts that you were referring to that are seminal needs to be something that is taught by means of activities that I think we're not experienced enough in. We teachers don't have enough experience in those activities. So we have a very big challenge ahead, and there is much to be done.
Michael?
Thank you, Fernando. Michael?
Let me turn this off here. Okay, there we go. Well, at Notre Dame, we've been teaching tradition, classicism, urbanism for about 30 years. And it began with fits and starts. People mentioned earlier that students weren't interested. Well, they were downright hostile 30 years ago. And it took us a while to figure out how to make the case. And in fact, it was through urbanism that we made the case about why one should study precedent, why you should go to travel and see the great cities of the world. Eventually, the curriculum that we ended up with began with a kind of introduction to the university year that belongs to the university and not to the school. So first year, we introduced a few courses, a history theory course that kind of allowed them to engage the language of architecture, a drafting course that allowed them to understand the language of media, and also a drawing course, actually very early on in the first year. The second year was really about how, the relationship of principles of construction and to architectural form. How principles of construction are idealized and become representational forms in buildings, actually across the world, not just in Europe and in the Americas. But there's a building technology course, there are theory courses, there are design courses that do all that. And also the second year spans the entire spectrum from urbanism to construction. Third year is entirely in Rome, and that's about how we live together and how we build, or urbanism, and the relationship between principles of urbanism and, again, architectural form. So by the time they get back in fourth year, out of a 5-year curriculum, they've really had a foundational experience in precedents of construction, precedents in urbanism, precedents in building typology, what's the use of the building or the purpose of the building, the higher purpose, not just the function. And they have a reintroduction to the United States and to the shared building traditions of the world. Fifth year is kind of an advanced studies year, initially presented mostly by the faculty, and the second semester through the thesis, the students engage it. But throughout the curriculum, we have precedent for almost everything. We don't ask our students for one precedent, as we used to, at least in my education. What's your precedent, singular? There are multiple precedents. There's precedents for air conditioning systems, precedents for fenestration, precedents for building typology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Michael. We did pretty well in terms of time. We should just keep it up, perhaps even go a little bit shorter in our next answers. The first question had to do with the absence of continuity of ideas in the present practice of architecture, the present teaching of architecture. The second one has with the question of buildings being built everywhere around us with no reference to the way in which they're placed in the city and in nature, and the effects they have on the fabric of the city and on the health of nature. So my second question is, how does your School of Architecture teach its students to operate within the context of an urban and a natural setting? Fernando?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Stefanos. Well, I believe that in general terms, the Madrid School of Architecture, which is actually, on the other hand, a very, very big school. I need to just explain that in a school where around 4,000 students are being taught, where we have around 400 professors, obviously generates lots of options, and somehow the existence itself of all of that variety of options guarantees a way of teaching that is very cross-cutting and touches many different aspects. But in general terms, I do believe that in the last few years, well, traditionally, in the school in Madrid, that's how it's been done. But we have been really studying the contexts that have to do with the settings, with the sites, with the locations. In that sense, the training that our students get is also within a structure of the Spanish model. It's a 5-year degree. It's 5 years plus 1 master's degree year. So in 6 years studies, after 6 years studies, we can say that in all the courses, there are some projects and subject matters that have to do with the environment. And there's always exercises that have to do with nature. There are always practical projects, and they have to take into account the context of the proposal or the building. So I believe that in that sense, our students are are now used to being in touch with the geographical problems, with the location problems, social approach as well. I think that we will be talking about that later on. But I think that we are providing them with teachings that are quite adapted to those challenges. So obviously there will always be that need to somehow keep on working on it, but I do think that we're achieving what we were set to do. Yes, Andrew?
Sanjeev?
Sanjeev?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do agree with the idea that the context is very important, and in order to bring in better designs, we are able to make our students understand how the context is very important, where the site is located. And in that way, we send our students for site recordings. In a way, they need to understand the context. They need to understand the spatial logic of the entire context. They need to understand the natural setting of the context. They need to understand the cultural setting of the whole context. And in a way, the cultural settings, they understand the architecture of that place also, and they make their own decisions how they will conceive the design within that context. So in a way, we basically all the site studies take into account the contextual parameters which they need before they start the conceptual design, and we are able to make them understand that the context is very important, where the site is located and what are the natural surroundings, which context which it is located in. So it is very important, and we make them understand through site visits, because I teach an undergraduate course, so we need to send them on site and understand the context. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, our whole curriculum is basically based on the idea of the city and its architecture. So we begin with the idea of the city. And the city in this case is presented as a kind of second nature, kind of in fact, much of the early philosophy is based on the book of my colleague and friend Norman Crow, Nature and the Idea of a Man-Made World. It traces the cities and nature throughout history, throughout the world. So the idea of landscape and nature as a natural world is also touched upon. And I think what the underpinnings of that are that we must have a reverence for all the ecosystems, be they natural or human or any other type, that have flourished around the world and are present to this day. So the idea of nature, the idea of cities is inextricably tied. The idea of reverence as a kind of operative system towards both is presented as essential to the students. And I think that's what excites them. They feel a kind of political activism, if you will, when they see it presented that way. If it's presented as a style, they just turn off and ignore it. But when you give them a moral imperative or an ethical imperative, that they get into.
Francisco?
Very interesting question. I guess the University of New Mexico, the School of Architecture and Planning, I guess the advantage is that we have different disciplines living within one building and that program. So we actually have community regional planning, which is really focused in community work, community engagement, and really going out to the communities and working with along with them. The architecture program, which is really strongly design focused, which I've also taught in basically all three departments. And we also have masters in culture, in landscape architecture. So we have this, and besides that, we also have historic preservation, which is not a department, but it's a graduate certificate program. as well as Indigenous Planning and Assistance Center, and just a variety of different ways of connecting students and having them basically open up and have the ability for them to take any type of course, which brings them back to the ability of finding out how we design in urban context and in nature. In architecture, which I taught in the first year, basically the design studios, which is the second year, we would give them the first semester, we would give them a project in nature. Second semester, it would always be a project in an urban context, and really have them define both of them and how buildings sit within both of these contexts. And then, of course, they evolve through the years, like Fernando was also talking about and Michael earlier. So thank you, Stefanos.
Thank you all. Here's the third question. If we assume that students are introduced to the necessity of dealing with architectural ideas that preceded them, and also are directed to think about their work as being a means and not an end, a means to building cities and to preserving or conserving rather the nature of the world in its purest state. How are your programs considering the formal traditions with which students may be operating on a project-to-project basis or in their practice long-term, in terms of regional, country, and world focus? I mean, where does the how is the student directed to look into what the history of form has been, which you're operating? Sanjeev?
When we look at the history of forms and in our region, what we have done at School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, is that we have two ways of documentation through which the students learn. One, we have taken them to actual tribal villages, which are within the context of nature, and the entire studio takes place in the village for a week or so, where they entirely document the village, they understand the village, and they understand the culture, they understand the ritual, they understand the material, they understand the natural setting or the context in which that village is located. And once when we come back to the college and we start doing it on the papers, then and we also locate a site within that village for. It is not a very practical project, but it is a hypothetical project which we float in the studio. For example, a primary school or kind of a Anganwadi, which is a kind of a crèche for kids. So that this whole design program, which is floated in the studio, takes into the entire context into the consideration and the entire studio. And we also try to bring in, ask them to bring in certain fusion of modern and traditional together, so the innovation and creative innovation takes place, and the student is excited to do that. So in a way, the studio with the major design problem, where he designs within that context, where he has done the case study, basically the documentation of the whole village, and does a design in that. I think that makes the student understand how context is very important, how the traditions are very important, how the rituals are very important. So, that is the way the studio goes.
Michael?
You know, the regional aspects of urbanism and architecture aren't, again, like I said before, not treated as stylistic differences, just to be acquired and appropriated and regurgitated and given out. The students are asked to look at climate, geology, the flora, the fauna, the history, the cultural history of making things, and to try to adapt the modern world to those conditions. So what does it take to be truly sustainable, resilient in a hot tropical climate? How do you ventilate a building? How do you air cool a building? How do you heat the building when necessary? How do you protect it from insects? How do you use the local materials? And we're looking at the whole life cycle of energy that is used. So the shipping of materials to a site goes into the consideration. So if you're bringing steel from 2,000 miles away or stone from 2,000 miles away, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And that equation about how you use materials has to do with the longevity of those materials and the assemblies that we produce. Typically, regional architecture is the most sustainable and resilient form of building because it uses all of that, what I just mentioned. Local materials, it reacts to local climate, it uses even some of the difficult circumstances to its advantage. So that's what we present as regionalism. And because it's not just about looking at the past and being nostalgic about it, but it's also about how do you build for the future? How do you build a built environment for 7 billion, 8 billion, 10 billion people and make it work in a way that still retains our humanity? So that's regionalism at Notre Dame.
Thanks. Fernando?
Well, I believe that we Spaniards, and more particularly my vision from my school, is that diversity itself, the diversity itself that we have in our peninsula, in our region, in the Iberic Peninsula, allows for that flexibility of being so close to a diverse and complex reality. I think that we Spaniards don't just have one historical tradition that is open to the world and that is quite rich and wealthy thanks to the wonderful relationship that we have with the Latin American world that has, I believe, improved us in general terms. It has improved the number of references that we work with. But I think in the last few years in university studies in general, but more particularly in architecture, we have made an effort to make students understand that they are before challenges that have to do with the environment, that have to do with, for instance, natural disasters, challenges that modern men need to face. The challenges that we are subject to due to all the problems that climate change is causing, the great challenge that the change of energy paradigm puts on the table, the big problems that contemporary models are facing due to socioeconomic dimensions. Even in Spain, in the last few years, we have a hot debate that is very much present in the School of Architecture to try and take stock of the different problems and opportunities that we find in the opposition between rural and urban. In a country such as Spain, the distribution between these two environments is quite irregular, and with coastal areas, we have lots of people living in capital cities, and then we have enormous parts of the interior that are completely empty. So with demographic densities that are even below Scandinavia or Siberia. So I think that this has caused in the last 10, 15 years for attention to shift towards these problems, and the curriculum has to consider this in an open way, and then the students themselves are very interested in what happens in the world and the speed with which we get inputs from the world over with regards to the way in which we build and create cities, I believe has improved the situation. So I don't think we're in a bad position when facing these challenges, although obviously in the next few years we will have to keep on working on them. Thank you, Fernando.
Fernando, muy buena respuesta.
A very good answer, Fernando.
feel that the School of Architecture at the University of New Mexico, I mean, architecture and planning, I don't want to exclude planning from it. Just New Mexico alone in the regional, the area, the zone, which is very arid. It's where we live in a desert, and basically the relationship, with Mohammed's earlier presentation in that region of the Middle East is very much like New Mexico. We do have the traditions are very much still part of this region, not just from the early pueblos, the early indigenous pueblos, which are still living. We do have over 19 of these indigenous original communities. The colonizers also brought in some materials that already existed, but basically transformed into more of that adobe tradition. Plus the religious and the water irrigations with the acequias, those traditions are still very much part of what the school teaches as well in the variety of different programs that we have. And when it comes to the country, we are living right now in a, it's a very difficult time, especially when it comes to politics in this country, where there's a denial in some cases from some of our political leaders of the global warming and what's about to happen in the next few years, where we're going to start probably losing coastal cities. We do have a lot in the United States of these coastal cities, and basically these transformations that Fernando talked about, with these global catastrophes, and when it comes to climate. So those, that is very much part of our program, and we try to get that to the student of the changing world and changing regions, and how we might eventually, like Sanjeev mentioned, going back to those early traditional ways of building, but at the same time, it's learning how the context of the structures, the passive solar, the way that people lived, I believe it was Antonio that mentioned this earlier in his presentation. And it's just part of the learning process of the student, learning that we live in a different era, especially now with what's happening with COVID. So that's what I have to say, Stefanos.
Thank you. Over the millennia, architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism have been the most profound way of structuring human life on the planet. So we're asking our students to, first of all, introduce their work into various settings. First, constructing that world in their minds, then representing it as completely and beautifully on paper as possible, and finally ask them to consider the means by which that work is constructed. To what extent are your schools studying and practicing traditional building methods and crafts, particularly in opposition to the current complete dominance of a technical regime that is operating on a singular level of production in steel, glass, and concrete? Fernando.
Well,
obviously, the technology that we teach in the School of Architecture is contemporary construction techniques. But of course, the teachers do organize activities that help students get in touch with small-scale construction, with building trades, etc. In the case of the School of Architecture of Madrid, 25 years ago, a dear colleague of mine, sadly passed, who was a director of the school for many years, Luis Maldonado, and myself, we organized an initiative called the Center for the Research on Traditional Architecture. During the last 25 years, we've made an effort teaching traditional construction techniques with earth, with stone, with wood, with adobe, For instance, the second Latin American seminar of earth construction was held in our school, and we've undertaken many initiatives of this type. But of course, many of the professors of our school have really focused on traditional architectural traditions. Enrique Nuere, one of the master woodworkers in our country, who was a former professor in our school. Of course, technology plays a very important role nowadays, but over the last 30 years, there has been many initiatives, small workshops, and a great interest has been raised on traditional techniques. I'm a professor of the history of architecture, and students are very reluctant to learn about history, but they do love to hear about history, not with a capital H, but with history of architecture of a much more modest, traditional scale. And I think the knowledge about these forms of construction has improved considerably. And many of our students are much better prepared today than they were 25 years ago to tackle these problems related to construction. But we have to continue working so that these knowledge is more systematically incorporated onto our curricula. However, I feel quite satisfied by some of the initiatives and experiences that we have. Okay, thank you, Michael.
Michael, Lykoudis?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I have to turn off the interpretation. I'm just trying to catch my thought. Yes. Well, traditional building construction is what is initially taught at Notre Dame. Our second year, as I mentioned, is about the relationship between building construction, the principles of construction, and architectural form, and how traditional architecture tends to be a kind of representation and idealization of those processes and methods of construction. And that's the foundation. And from there, the students learn how construction evolved or didn't evolve, in fact, but how crafts play a role in it. Our summer programs will often send students to places like Florence, to the UK, other areas all over the world, and they can either firsthand experience the making through crafts, or see how crafts have impacted the regional character of cities and buildings. And we used to have, and it'd be interesting to re-explore this, a program on architectural crafts and the relationship to the buildings, and they would actually do woodwork and architectural details. We do have a furniture program, which is quite popular, where students have a hands-on experience with the making of things, designing something and actually making it. So that, in a nutshell, that's how we approach it at Notre Dame.
Sanjeev?
Regarding traditional methods and crafts, we need to understand that traditional material, especially I'm not talking about palaces and all, but I'm talking about hardcore vernacular. The materials have structural limitations. So we need to make, in our studio, we make students understand that. And we have certain guest lectures by professionals who are practicing in contemporary vernacular in India. So the guest lectures by them, how they have dealt with the traditional material and how they have brought in certain modern material and fused traditional and modern together, and they are able to produce buildings which are contemporary vernacular in nature. So these visiting professionals who come to SPA Bhopal, I think two or three of the practicing architects who are doing contemporary vernacular practice in India. So they come and they are able to make students understand how the traditional material can be fused with the modern material and how the essence of the whole vernacular architecture can be kept. So when we give them the design problem, we give them a condition that 25% of material used can be in modern, and the 75%, some kind of a proportion is decided upon within the studio, and the student has to work with that. So in that way, we are able to bring in modern and traditional material together, and kind of a contemporary vernacular emerges out of it.
Francisco?
Yes, good question, Stefanos. I guess it's not a major focus when it comes to the architecture program. However, the students do have an opportunity be part of elective courses that do teach these types of technologies, and I do the bulk of the teaching when it comes to these traditional technologies. And Fernando mentioned it earlier, that and I mentioned it, in the past question when it comes to adobe. And adobe is in earth is basically the traditional material here in New Mexico, and learning of making adobe, but the soil compositions and the granulometry when it comes to making these plasters and these adobes are very important when it comes to teaching those students who are eventually going to go into a world of building and making. Since the past probably 10 years that I've been there, and I basically have been moving up until now, being the director of the Historic Preservation and Regionalism program, I have taken on a variety of different courses, and basically all the courses that I teach, there is either the teaching of making these adobes or these constructions, including rammed earth, but also the application of how we take these traditional materials and apply them into a contemporary context. So that one thing is that not to imitate what has already been done, but the idea is to promote these materials as contemporary materials. And I think Sanjeev might have mentioned this before, of how we take these materials and maybe mix them with other materials, as long as you understand them and what you can do and how far you can go when it comes to these materials. And recently I've been in touch with I've been part of the TICRAT for now 26 plus years. And this is a binational program that we have with Mexico. So now that this branch or this program and these workshops of the TICRAT, which is the Taller Internacional de Restauración y Conservación de Arquitectura de Tierra, is basically reviving and in many cases restoring, conserving the materials and the buildings, which are very important as these memories of the past, and we shouldn't let them get deteriorated and destroyed, because I think that the future generations really need these types of buildings and this type of architecture in urban developments.
There was a poll recently in the United States, and the public was asked about their preferences, traditional and non-traditional, for federal buildings, for government buildings. The response was overwhelming. 75% of people preferred traditional form for public buildings. This is particularly shocking considering the political division of the United States at this point. So the last question is, what is your school doing or your program doing to engage your community or communities in bridging popular and professional opinions? By professional, I mean elite opinions as opposed to popular opinions. Michael?
Well, we started many years ago working with the city of South Bend, and we prepared a master plan for re-envisioning the central business district, or the core of the city. And at first, the profession actually fought the master plan. The public officials and the public embraced it. And so through discussions and through time, our last mayor, not the current one, the current one has continued the policies of the last mayor, but the last mayor, some of you may have heard of him, Pete Buttigieg, he ran for president last year. He adopted many of those principles: two-way streets, zero lot line construction, mixed use. So there was actually, we diffused the architectural political issues and just presented them as human issues. And then the architects kind of fell in line. And I think that we've had quite a bit of success in South Bend and on the Notre Dame campus in bringing about these ideas. But we've also, in Italy, Samir Yunus and Ettore Mazzola would have these studios in which all the faculty actually embraced, where they would go into towns invited either by mayors or by the city councils in Italy and find areas that needed help, and we would produce master plans. And sometimes they were adopted, sometimes they were certainly all published, and they sold out almost immediately. So, we don't present this as the elite coming in. We present this as, we're listening to you, and what would you like to see in your town? And using our education through precedent to understanding the shared values of the world, how do we bring all of these things together and present them in a cohesive and coherent manner to the community? So it's really about community outreach at all levels, local, regional, and international.
Francisco?
Sorry for interrupting.
Short of time.
Yeah, we have to go into questions, and I hope you agree. We have many questions from the public, and I think they are also interesting for the conversations.
Very good, Alejandro. Let's do that. Thank you.
Let's start by this one from Eva Niño, who asks. She's commenting that in her experience in the school, she could learn traditional building techniques, but then she was not allowed to apply her interest in traditional architecture in the studio design subjects. So she could not design traditionally in the school. So she's asking if this is the case in your schools, and how could be this transformed for the future or improved for the future?
I will not ask Fernando that question, but what about Francisco?
God, that's a good question, and I can also do it in Spanish as well. Can you guys hear me?
Make it very short, I think, because we're going to run really seriously out of time.
Well, I feel that there's, at our program, I feel that there's a possibility, but what happens in at least in the US, things are quite structured. I'm pretty sure, like Michael and Fernando and Sanjeev had also expressed. So when it comes to independent projects and topic projects, or you have a variety of different programs that you can go into. It's not necessarily architecture. You can go into planning, community regional planning, or you can also go into historic preservation or even landscape architecture. So there's a variety of choices when it comes to developing your ideas, when it comes to if you really want to tackle and actually move on to doing what might be considered a traditional type of architecture. I feel that there is room for that, but it has to be quite specific as well. However, when it comes to the actual design within the studio, you're able to use rammed earth or Adobe. It depends on what you're designing and what you're actually building.
Next one, Alejandro.
Sanjeev, me parece que quería. Yeah. Sanjeev, do you want to comment too?
Yes. Actually, in SPA Bhopal, this vernacular studio is in second year and its first semester. So students they start developing their own philosophy of vernacular, contemporary vernacular, and when they reach final year, where they have this final year project, I think in SPA Bhopal, there are always 5 or 6 students who choose vernacular philosophy as their guiding principle for these projects. And they, because I have conducted vernacular studio here, so all those 5 come to me as their supervisor. So we in undergraduate, we allow such projects and we give freedom to the students to choose their projects and whichever philosophy they want to follow. At master's level in conservation and landscape, students are able to choose traditional philosophy as their projects, and they are able to pursue their interests.
I would just add one sentence, and that is that separating research in traditional architecture and construction from design and practice in traditional architecture and construction destroys the whole cause of understanding the world in more complex ways other than a singular tech-based way of dealing with every design problem in the entire world independent of context.
Well, thanks to you all. I continue with another question. This one from Mohammed, who is he's asking if given that the needed partners for the development of traditional architecture and the practice of traditional architecture are the builders and craftspeople, how could we involve them more as part of the educational system?
Michael?
Well, I think that's, there are many levels. I mean, you can bring them as visiting faculty. You can bring them on your faculty. You can have, workshops for, 3 or 4 days or a week or whatever long you like. There are many ways to do that. That's not a difficult problem to solve. I think what the more difficult problem to solve is to get the other schools of architecture, the ones that are actually fighting this a philosophy of humanism in their schools to do this. That's the real issue. I think all of us who are sympathetic to tradition don't have a problem doing that. We could probably do more of it. I mean, I think certainly at Notre Dame we could have. I think we could do a lot more of it, but that's another story. But I think the mechanics are easy. So.
Next question, Alejandro.
No sé si alguien más quiere.
I don't know if someone else wants to ask further questions.
Next question comes from Felipe de Crescenzo. His question is that there is he finds there is a lack of interest in many people for these traditional forms and techniques, and he's asking how the teaching of vernacular and traditional architecture could contribute to the continuity of these traditions. So it's very broad.
Fernando, do you want to answer that one? Sanjeev, go ahead. Answer it.
If you are able to have a successful and a wonderful vernacular studio in college, I think some of the students who graduate from undergraduate courses, they make it a philosophy, contemporary vernacular as a philosophy. And you will find a number of people practicing in India with the philosophy of contemporary vernacular, and a lot of high-end projects and resorts and all. They are within the nature, within a very strong natural context, and vernacular goes very well with that. So there are projects which demand contemporary vernacular, and if certain students have taken on this philosophy of contemporary vernacular, and they are practicing, and some of my students are practicing contemporary vernacular now. They are in the profession. So I see that that if the vernacular studio or vernacular curriculum in the institute or in the school is very strong, I think we will be able to churn out students who have this vernacular philosophy as the guiding principle in practice.
Thank you, Sanjeev. We have another question from Carol. It's addressed to Michael. It's to how much demand there is for students trained in a fully traditional and classical program.
Yeah, well, that's a great question because we love answering it. This is a question that came up back in the early 90s when we first started teaching classicism. Where are all these students going to go? We found that there may be 3 or 4 offices back then that taught tradition in the United States and 2 or 3 abroad. But even the students that didn't go to traditional offices found that the knowledge they had acquired at Notre Dame was useful to the modernist firms. Now, since then, when there were a handful, maybe 10 firms worldwide, now there are hundreds. It is not a problem for our students to go and work anywhere in the world, actually. And even our international students who have gone back to Central America, South America, Europe, Asia, find ways of engaging tradition in their countries, either through practice, through teaching, or perhaps getting involved in the municipal government. But just so everyone knows, even in the worst of times, we've managed to place at least half of our students, if not more, in offices. For instance, 2008, which is a terrible time in this country. A little bit less than half the students had jobs. By a year later, some of them still had trouble, but most of them had found jobs. In good times, we have far more firms looking for our students than we have students. For instance, I think a couple of years ago, before COVID, we had 70 firms to hire 60 students in our career fair. And that doesn't include all the firms that are silently looking to hire our students. So I think there's 2 things. This country in particular has been able to absorb a very large number of people trained in the manner that we train our students. Secondly, they go to places sometimes which don't necessarily reflect traditions, but they appreciate and know how to use the skills that they have learned. And the international students that go back home to all sorts of places, they carve their own way. Sometimes they make their own firms after a while. And, in Panama and Guatemala, in particular, you can see some significant powerhouse firms working there that have been trained at Notre Dame.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have some more questions, and one is from Victor Tironi. He's asking if you could recommend some kind of personal training for architects who have to learn traditional architecture on their own, and if you have any recommendation on ways to learn traditional architecture on their own.
Francisco?
Let me take a crack at it. Just, I think there's many great books that one can read. One can look at build a bibliography, ask people how to make a bibliography. There are also courses taught by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in New York, which are virtual, and those are a good start. They can help help one develop a studio in their own home. So there's many ways you can do it, but I think bibliography and looking for online courses, and there are some, that can help you do that.
Can I jump in, Stefanos?
Yes, please.
I was going to say just come to the University of New Mexico, but I guess there's different ways of doing it. I mean, Michael did mention the possibility of a bibliography. It just depends on what exactly are you looking for, because when it comes to traditional building methods and techniques, these technologies can be vast. And I mean, you just saw some of the early presentations today, from the mosque, which I truly feel that it's an amazing building, to the most modest, hut type of structure. So dealing with these traditional materials, it just depends exactly on what exactly are you looking for. Are you looking for more of the Middle Eastern type of adobe type of construction, the stone hut type of construction with thatched roofs, or the more traditional, maybe original Southwest type of our adobe architecture that we have here in our region? But I would say that if you are interested in such a work or this type of architecture, you actually go, if you want to continue your studies, go to these places that actually do offer this type of traditions and architecture and that actually are living, communities. And it's not just about learning it in book, but also going and touching it as well. I think the tangible part of it, I think it's very important.
Joe?
Well, if you'll give me a second, I would like to say that in Spain, during these last few years, we have seen an extraordinary development of traditional construction workshops, for instance, with stonework or earth or carpentry or quarries. In our architecture school, we have actually a course with quarry masters, and we have students who come from all over the world who come to learn traditional techniques for quarries. And we actually have a sculptor, a master sculptor, whose task is to train our students in everything that has to do with the technical aspects and traditional aspects of stonework. So I think that university structures are already making an effort, but they have to work with associations, and they have to be a part of initiatives of things that are happening in some municipalities, in some regions. It's true, obviously, that there is a wealth of information that can be found online, books and documentaries and so on. But I think that it is becoming easier to find opportunities to be a part of workshops that will last 20, 30, 60 hours, that can last 2-3 days or 2 weeks. And these last few years, I have organized some workshops in Segovia. Alejandro could actually tell you about the extraordinary experience that we have had with these workshops when we were training a group of architects and postgraduate students who have worked in the north of Africa, in Morocco, and they have carried out an amazing experience in Rashidia by restoring heritage built with earth in Morocco, which is amazing. And the starting point of that experience was actually a short workshop that lasted a week that we organized in Segovia. So I think it is becoming easier and easier to find these products, this academy products. And Paco Uviña was saying it. I think you have to go, you have to be there, because I think that the tangible side of things is key so that we can really understand these technical aspects.
Muy bien. Gracias a todos.
Thank you all. We're going to be closing this panel discussion. We were supposed to have a break now. This break is a break that will last half an hour. It's a longer break. And after that half an hour, we will continue with our last panel discussion, which will be mainly focusing on the relationship that architects have with craftsmasters and in construction, and the relationship that is created when architects are interested in tradition and when And when they collaborate with these masters, with this master builders, the right master builders, and we will have some very good examples of this sort of collaboration.
This is an endless quest, so I'm sure we'll be talking about it again and soon.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Stefano.
Bye.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the
Gracias a
attendees
todos.
too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you very much.
Bye.